Hey, Crosspoint students, man, it's so good to be with you. My name's Tanner, and a lot of you know that I lead worship on Wednesday nights, but I love when I get a chance to come and join you guys in your small group setting. And so we've been in this series, right, called Vibes. And last week we talked about our vibes and emotions and how if we're not careful, they can control us. And since none of us likes being controlled, handling our emotions is probably something that we want to get better at. And so as we continue this conversation today, I want to start by asking you a question. Okay, here we go. Are you ready? What would you do if you knew you would never get caught and there would be no consequences? Take a second and think about that. Okay, let me say it again. What would you do if you knew you would never get caught and there would be no consequences? Now, I want you to turn to the person next to you and share what you said. No, I'm just kidding. Don't say anything. I don't think any of us need to hear what each other's answers were to that. I imagine that some of you had stuff come to mind that surprised even you. And maybe something popped into your brain and you were like, man, thank goodness there are no mind readers in here. And the truth is we all have the potential to think some wild thoughts. We're just smart enough not to talk about it. We're all experts at monitoring our behavior so that only the good stuff is seen for the most part. And while we've learned to monitor our behavior, the problem is that we've never really learned how to monitor our emotions, our hearts, where the emotions come from. And like we talked about last week, it's important that we learn how to monitor our emotions because our emotions have a big impact on the way that we treat ourselves and other people. And that's a big deal to Jesus. Now, you may notice that I have a jar full of mints. And this is what I want you to do. Think of it this way. If I tip this jar over, tipping it over doesn't determine what comes out, right? What's already inside here determines what comes out. If mints are on the inside, then mints are coming out. If I shake this jar up, it doesn't determine what comes out of here. Shaking this just exposes what's already in here. And the same can be said about our emotions. They're inside of us. The question is, how do they come out? Which is why I think what King Solomon said is so important. It's in a book from the Old Testament, a book called Proverbs, and he said this: above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And what Solomon was saying is what's going on inside of you is important. Why? Because what comes out of you comes from your heart. We can all try to watch our actions and monitor our behavior, but that's not the real problem, right? The real problem is taking care of what's on the inside. Because good or bad, whatever is inside, it's coming out just like this jar of mints. And let's be honest with ourselves. We can all admit that we have some problems on the inside, right? Most of us can quickly think of things we've done or said or thought that no one else is allowed to know about because we all have stuff on the inside of us that's not great. And when that stuff comes out of us and we do or say something that's not great, the result is usually a different emotion that can end up controlling us. And I'm talking about guilt. All right, now guilt is a loaded word because there are different kinds of guilt. And the first is false guilt. That's the guilt you feel when you aren't really guilty. You feel bad about something you didn't do or feel bad about something that wasn't a big deal. But then there is actual guilt, and that's what we're going to camp out in today. That's what we're going to talk about. This is the kind of guilt you feel when you did something you shouldn't have done or you said something you shouldn't have said. It's when you hurt someone who deserved better. Feeling this legitimate guilt isn't a bad thing in and of itself, right? But it becomes a problem when something you've done in the past becomes a part of your identity. So let's be clear. Nobody likes to feel guilt. So instead of doing something about it, when we feel it, we tend to stuff it away. And we have messages that we say to ourselves about the things we feel guilty about. Things like, I wasn't the only one, or I was going through a bad phase, or, man, that's not my fault. And we tell ourselves these stories to make the guilt less powerful or so we don't feel quite as bad. But here's the thing. When we make excuses for our guilt or pretend like it's not a big deal, the guilt doesn't go anywhere. We actually end up giving our guilt more power. Think about it. Guilt creates a debt-debtor relationship with others. In other words, it creates an IOU out of a relationship. Why? Because we have taken something from them. When we hurt someone else, we take things, right? We take their reputation, their trust, their self-esteem, and so we owe them. We even say things like, I owe them an apology. But the thing is, we don't see guilt as a debt to pay back. We experience guilt like a weight. When we carry around a weight, it throws us off balance. Carrying the weight of guilt throws us off balance. Which explains why when we fix a relationship and make it right, we say something like this: I feel like a weight has been lifted off of my shoulders. That's not all. The other tricky thing about guilt is it doesn't stay with that person that we feel guilt towards. You may feel guilty about how you talk to your stepmom, but then you'll bring it with you when you're hanging out with your friends. And all of a sudden what happened with your stepmom now has you in a bad mood with your friends. So we don't deal with guilt. It grows. It evolves into anger. Anger at ourselves for behaving a certain way. Anger at not being able to move past it. And the thing about anger is it doesn't stay inside of us. It eventually comes out. The truth is we're all guilty about something. So we're also in danger of letting our guilt become anger and our anger turning into being defensive. Because we don't like people pointing out where we may have gotten it wrong, because there's a reason for that. If we own up to our guilt and admit that what we did wasn't okay, we'll see what we did for what it was: sin. And that leaves us feeling condemned, convicted, and judged. In other words, we'll feel bad because we'll see that we did something bad and we can't undo it. We can't unsay that thing or untalk that way or untreat someone that way. And eventually we realize that even though this thing is in the past, it's not completely gone. It's still there as a part of our story. Here's the good news. You don't have to be defined by your past, and you don't have to deny it either. Jesus offers a different way, a way to no longer be controlled by our guilt, our shame, or our anger. And that's what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. All right, I want to look at something the Apostle Paul said. And it's important that we know who said this, because Paul, he had more regret and guilt than our entire student ministry combined. He wasn't just a preacher trying to make a point. He lived it. All right, he was ashamed of his past and felt guilty because the early part of his life, before he became known as the Apostle Paul, he was known as Saul of Tarsus. And Saul spent his time hunting down followers of Jesus so that he could arrest them and have them tortured, imprisoned, or even killed. And he did more than that. He did more than let it happen. He made it happen. But then Paul's life changed, and he became a follower of Jesus. And instead of killing Jesus' followers, he made it his life's mission to encourage more people to follow Jesus. But his past was still his past. It's likely that he had to face the families of people he went after before he followed Jesus. And there's no question that he dealt with regret and guilt, knowing what he had done and remembering the faces of people he'd arrested or even killed. But what makes his story so amazing is that he doesn't distance himself from his past. He doesn't run away from it, try to hide it, or deny it. He doesn't make excuses like, well, that was before I met Jesus, so, it doesn't really count. No. Instead, he told his story and he owned it. All right? He wrote about it in a letter to Christians living in Rome. It says, therefore, there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit, who gives life, has set you free from the power of sin and death. In other words, he tells people that because of Jesus, something new happened. You don't have to pretend that you didn't do something wrong. There's freedom in owning up to God what you said or did. And when you call it what it is, that weight comes off your shoulders and you can stop running and making excuses, and you can let all of that go and find freedom. How? Paul tells us. He says, for what the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh. All right? Meaning all the law could do was show us how we got it wrong. It points out the ways we've messed up, but it can't fix anything for us. It can't take that weight away, and it definitely doesn't give us freedom. But that can be found. So Paul goes on and says, for what the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering. Meaning Jesus had no guilt. He did nothing wrong. He came and lived the perfect life, and he died a criminal's death so that we can be free. And we have every reason to feel guilty. Jesus has none. And yet Jesus is the one who died. And because of that, we no longer have to feel guilty. Think of it this way. Because of Jesus, guilt doesn't have to be the boss of you. We can live guilt-free. Jesus took it all. It's like he's saying, bring all of your guilt over, all of the stuff you've ever done, and own it. What you did was wrong. It wasn't okay. We both agree that you messed up and are guilty, but that is not the end of the story. I don't see you that way anymore, and I don't want you to see yourself that way either. I want you to see yourself the way that I do. Paul wraps up that thought by saying, and so he, God, condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fully met in us, who do not live according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Paul is saying, God has made the relationship between you and him guilt-free. You are guilty because you did something you shouldn't have. We all have. But you're not condemned. And that guilt, it doesn't define you anymore. What Jesus did on the cross, that defines you. Jesus took the guilt on himself, and now you're free. Here's the thing. The way Paul writes, it can be a bit confusing. And if you're sitting there thinking, what does this even mean? I get it. But I don't want us to miss this because it sounds confusing. When you decide to take God at his word, when you trust that Jesus is who he says he is and did what he said he was going to do, a few things happen. Number one, you're no longer allowed to condemn yourself or punish yourself. Guilt's not the boss of you. You belong to God, and God says that you are not condemned. So when that voice of shame and guilt tries to weigh you down, you can say, Jesus took care of that for me. That's not who I am anymore. I belong to Jesus. Number two, your guilt will remind you, but it will not define you. That's so good. Meaning what you did doesn't disappear. You may have some lessons to learn, but that thing you did, the thing you said, it isn't who you are. Let your past be the thing that makes a change in you. Let it lead you to show gratitude to God for who you are now. Number three, you don't get to condemn others for their mistakes. When you realize what Jesus has done for your guilt, you understand that he's done the same thing for others. And you don't get to judge, hate on, or criticize others for their mistakes. Your past mistakes position you perfectly to love everyone else despite their mistakes. Number four, you are free to make things right with the person you hurt, without excuses or an expectation of getting something back in return. This is huge because sometimes we think that what we did, when we do something wrong, the most important thing for us to do is just pray and ask God for forgiveness and everything is fine. But it's not always fine. Jesus cares about making it right, not with him, but with the person you hurt. So go ahead and pray for forgiveness, but then go out and make it right with the other person. Whatever you took from them, trust, friendship, self-esteem, own it. And here's the thing, it's possible that your willingness to be humble and approach that person will do more than just keep the guilt from controlling you. It might allow them to deal with the hurt and emotion inside of them that they may not even have known they had. In fact, what if it's the reason you're here today? What if someone is waiting on you to make the first move and make things right? What if that's the way forward and the way out of the weight of guilt? Don't let pride or fear or worry be the thing that keeps you from righting that relationship. Maybe the best thing you can do is let the guilt vibe go and humble yourself and seek forgiveness from the person that you hurt. Now, I get that it's scary, but remember, as long as we hold on to the guilt, we are letting our past define us, and Jesus came to change that. Our past can remind us, but it will not define us. And maybe today is a day that changes. Maybe today is a day you really understand that because of what Jesus did, you're no longer condemned. Guilt is not in control. That vibe is not going to call the shots. There's no room for the vibes of guilt, shame, embarrassment, and pride. Because of Jesus, all of that is gone. As we head out to small groups, as you guys get ready to have a conversation together, remember and pass the same love on to others despite their mistakes. Because of Jesus, guilt doesn't have to be the boss of you, and it doesn't have to be the boss of the people around you either. Have a great time. I love you guys.